Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to your latest and possibly greatest, possibly not, episode of Friday Ramblings. I'm your host, David, aka the Bardic One, aka the man who loves to ramble, and we're going to sit there and take a little step into video games. But specifically, instead of just reviewing a game or trying to break down and make sense of a grand mythos over a large franchise, I thought that we would do something a little different and we would discuss something a little thematic that tends to get overlooked in a particular franchise. And the franchise we're talking about, for those of you who read our titles, is Castlevania. But specifically, what we're going to talk about in Castlevania is not the literary references and inspirations, not the history of the franchise and how it went from kind of a classic platformer to a puzzle platformer to the infamous Metroidvania style playing. And really that's split between pre-Symphony of the Night and Symphony of the Night going forward, which really kind of cemented the whole Metroidvania term and gameplay style for many of the Castlevania games. Few of the portables didn't so much rely on that feel, but it's a thing. No, we're not going to get into the Metroidvania thing. Nope, we're going to discuss a little bit about the mythos, but specifically the idea of, despite the Belmonts classically being a big, muscular, whip-swinging type family of heroes, and even most of the games where you're not playing the Belmonts, you're still traditionally playing big macho men with big biceps and big weaponry and whips and spears. And we're going to sit there and do a little bit of a salute to the various female protagonists who have had a major impact on the Castlevania story, mythos, and sometimes flat-out gameplay. That's right, we are giving the ladies their spotlight because, let's be honest, we all like to see some ladies in our gaming, in our literature. You know, whether it's rescuing the damsel in distress, playing the strong, heroic female in of herself. I know there's a term for female hero, but it also sounds like a infamous drug, so I've always felt kind of weird using that term. So yeah, it's just female heroes where we're going to go in this particular video. If you want to call me grammar foul for it, go for it. I don't know. I just think maybe we can come up with a better word after the centuries due to the, what do they call it, homophone of the two words there. Yeah. But yes, female protagonists of the heroic sort. Or, if not directly playable heroic, at least plot significant. And that's where we're going to start. Two women who are plot significant. Because without them, there'd be no Castlevania mythos. And that is the two wives of Dracula. Now, in the Castlevania lore, Dracula started off as a human named Matthias. Again, it's Eastern European, not 100% on the pronunciation. There is an H in there, so I'm going with Matthias. If somebody else wants to sit there and, correct me on my pronunciations, I will not take offense, as per usual. But yes, there was a human named Matthias, and he married a woman named Elisabetha Kronquist. Again, it's kind of weird. It's a V instead of a U. It's very Old English, but Elisabetha Kronquist, who unfortunately suffered a tragic death. And as such, the man Matthias would begin a descent into depression and despair and desperation, which would forever set him on the path to becoming a powerful dark sorcerer and eventually undead Lord of the Vampires known as Dracula. Now, as I said, she is more of a background element in that she's never playable. The game that gets into her story, it's not even so much her story, it's Matthias' story. She dies at the beginning of it. So, but as I said, it is significant to the lore because had he not suffered that loss, he would have never become Dracula, and there would have been no need for the Belmont clan to arise and eventually slay Dracula. Specifically, the reason the Belmonts took this up, for those people who do want a few more plot spoilers in your videos, if not, feel free to just jump a few seconds. Matthias' friend was the man known as Leon Belmont, and Leon found himself being partially manipulated into setting up Matthias' fall into becoming the Dark Lord Dracula, and therefore, although he never directly confronted the Vampire Lord, took it as the familial responsibility to end this, since they were there at the beginning. Next up, we jump forward a few centuries, now completely undead, and fully embracing the title of Dracula. He did once again fall in love with a mortal woman known as Lisa. Lisa, you are the one who could awaken the heart of the damned. Lisa. Little musical moment for you folks. Now, yes, well, we are generally going to stick to the video games. I'm going to throw this out there because it is going to come up a couple more times in this video. Lisa is the wife of Dracula shown in Season 1 and 2 of the Netflix Castlevania series. And her backstory is basically the same. It is expanded upon. A few more specific details of her life as Dracula's wife are gone into via flashbacks. But the quick summary for those who have not seen the series or played the games that discuss her fate. She was eventually, after many years being married to Dracula, burned at the stake by the church for consorting with the damned. I mean, technically they weren't wrong in this one, but the problem is, as we saw in the animated series, because again it did go into a lot more detail than the games did, as this was background material, those very quickly run through in the games. When you're specifically consorting with the Lord of Vampires, who also tends to have control over many other lesser demonic entities, and thus has an army of the damned at his call, probably not a good idea to burn his wife alive. Just saying. You might not want to piss that particular person off if you don't have to. This event would cement in Dracula's mind that he needs to declare active war on humanity, thus setting up the events of Dracula's Curse, the third Castlevania game, and the one where we have Trevor Belmont being the first Belmont to directly confront and slay Dracula. At least temporarily slay. He keeps coming back. They would eventually get into that in the later game lore, but that's another video. Now, the reason Lisa factors into the plot of Castlevania 3 is not just because her death caused Dracula to declare war, but Dracula's half-mortal, half-vampire son he had with Lisa Alucard would side with humanity, feeling that Dracula's rage was blinding him to what his mother valued, which is that Dracula could be what he was and still live in relative peace with humanity. Thus, Alucard would be a potential playable protagonist for the first time in a Castlevania game. The way they did Castlevania 3 was that you play as Trevor Belmont in every stage, but you have the option of switching out with one of 3 potential sidekicks. When you pick up one sidekick, the other one is dismissed. It creates a lot of interesting replay value for the game because the different sidekicks all play different from Trevor and all have their own unique skills. For instance, Alucard can turn into a bat and fly for short distances, thus allowing a lot of the tricky jump sequences to be, for all intents and purposes, skipped. And trust me, having played that game for many, many, many hours over many, many years, off and on, yes, there are some tricky jump sequences that, frankly put, never get easy. I don't care how many times you play a particular level, those jumps are always going to give you a moment of tension and anxiety. Because if any of the NES Castlevania games, or if there's anything the various NES Castlevania games have going for them, it is that the jumps are very precise. Speaking of Castlevania 3, though, and the Netflix adaptation that was heavily inspired by Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, we get up to our next female. Yes, taking a page from Samus Aran and the gender ambiguity until the special ending revealed all, we have Sipho Belnades. Now, Sipho, as I said, is one of your 3 potential recruits due to the branching path of the game. You may never, in fact, encounter her, and when you encounter her, the game is very coy about the fact that Sipho is a her. Walking around in a big cloak, casting magic, Sipho is simply Sipho until the very end of the game, where if you beat it with the team of Trevor and Sipho, it is revealed Sipho is in fact a female and has fallen in love with Trevor over their journey. Now, this is interesting because even though it was the 3rd game and it was relatively early in the franchise, yes, they did pull the Samus Aran gender ambiguity thing, but the fact of the matter is, the developers knew Sipho was a female, and that means that, even though she is technically optional, it did provide the first time in the Castlevania franchise that a female would be the controllable player character, even if not the primary protagonist. This was a step in the right direction, although the impact of it was not felt for the next few games, simply due to the nature of, it was one of those things that they were trying. The franchise was very experimental for its first 4 or 5, 6 or 7 games. Depends on how much you want to count the Game Boy ones, or if you're just concerned with like major console releases. That's just the way video game franchises. I mean, it's like the Mario games. When you talk about, do you go like Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, 3 World? Do you count Mario Land 1 and 2 as part of that main series timeline, or are they over to the side? Once you get past Mario World, do you count Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, since Yoshi is the playable character and Mario is just a plot point? Or is that the beginning of the Yoshi sub-franchise, which lives way over here? And then again, Mario Land 3 was technically the first Wario Land game, so is that another split in the Mario Land side? Or is it kind of like it's still a Mario Land game, even though Mario doesn't really appear except for in the end cinematic sequence? Castlevania kind of got like that, but again, I'm not going to get super detailed on it. The basics of it is you had the 3 Castlevania games, you had Super Castlevania, they did a series of portable games. There was a game on the Sega Genesis, and they made there was the whole Dracula X Rondo of Blood thing. And then things jumped to the PlayStation for Symphony of Night. A while later, they came back and did games for the various Nintendo portables again. There's a whole slew of them on the DS and 3DS. Oh yeah, speaking of the various Castlevania games, because again, I know this was a bit of a sidetrack, but I'm also kind of laying the groundwork for some of the other characters we're going to discuss in a minute. We are not going to discuss characters from the Lords of Shadow timeline. The Lords of Shadow games are the latest Castlevania games. However, they are an alternate timeline, and frankly, I find that the Lord of Shadow mythos, since it is a full-fledged reboot of continuity, start the story over from scratch kind of alternate timeline, that is no doubt in the future going to be a separate video. Because having known they were building a coherent mythos from the get-go, it is definitely fascinating enough to deserve its own video. So yes, there's a reason I'm not discussing Lords of Shadow versions of some of these characters, and that is because that is content for a future video. Also, why I'm kind of rushing through the Netflix mentions. Yes, Sipho and Lisa were part of the Netflix series. However, we're not really going to discuss the Netflix series. That may be another potential future video. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed the 2 seasons. I'm anxious for season 3. So it's a thing. Now, let's see. Let's go over my little list here. So we discussed Lisa. We discussed Sipho. Alright. We're going to go ahead and, because we did talk about alternate timelines, we're going to discuss a couple characters who are from alternate timelines. The basics of this is, as I said before, a minute ago, because a lot of Castlevania games are produced with very little concern for continuity and a coherent mythos, and that is not a slight against Castlevania. Let's be honest, the Mario games have basically no continuity at all. The Legend of Zelda games had to have a bit of massaging and intentional writing after the fact. I'm sorry. Look, I love the Zelda games to death, but if you lived through the NES to Super NES, Game Boy on the side eras, and saw the games as they were being released, played through them as they were being released, it's pretty clear that except for some very, very minor plot elements of like Zelda 2, that really up until God, I would probably say Ocarina of Time. But even then, it wasn't an immediate impact. There was still a few games that came out for the next several years. Like Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, or when they firmly planted the idea of a greater Hyrule mythos. But yeah, like they were like 5-6 games in. Again, I'd have to check the release dates on some of them, and again, if you count the Oracle 2 games, but were really 1 game Pokemon thing. Again, that's another video. We're getting a little bit off track. The whole point of it is many, many video games from the early eras did not worry about coherent continuity and mythos. Woo! Distracting hands. Let's distract from the fact that the early game industry was worried more about making games that were fun to play than having stories that could, inspire and be adapted into movies and TV series. Distracting hands, distracting fingers. Ooh, bat. It's Castlevania bat. Many, many bats in Castlevania. Bat. So anyway, as I was saying, When they finally did attempt to make a coherent timeline to Castlevania, they found certain games just plain didn't fit. There was no way to make them work, mostly because of continuity contradictions with other games. So, some games were jettisoned from the main timeline. They exist. It's not that the developers were embarrassed about the games. Their stories just don't fit with anything else. So we're going to talk about a couple of those games right now, specifically the female playable protagonists of those games. I know that was a lot of build-up, but again, I can't assume everybody watching this video has spent as many years as I have dabbling in Castlevania, and I freely admit I have not played every Castlevania game, not even close. I'm not a super expert, but I am a fan. So, first up we have on the original Game Boy. Multiple games were produced. There was specifically one called Castlevania Legends. And Castlevania Legends was the first game to have a flat-out, this is your playable protagonist, this person is female, admitting it from the get-go, primary protagonist, woo! But more importantly than that is that, because again, timelines, storylines are a little weird. At the time of this game's release, it was intended that Sonia Belmont was the first Belmont to encounter Alucard, and as such encounter Dracula. Again, this is part of the reason why the game was a little awkward, because later on they would release later games that got more into the origins of Dracula and Leon Belmont being Matthias' friends. But at the time of its release, Castlevania Legends was the first game chronologically in the looser timeline, and was the first attempt to discuss the origins of the Dracula-Belmont feud. Now, what also makes this interesting from a storyline standpoint, and it is a highly playable game, so I would encourage anybody who is enjoying other Castlevania games to track down a copy somewhere on the internet and give Castlevania Legends a quick run-through, is that Sonia Belmont not only was first to encounter Dracula, and the first Belmont to make friends with Alucard, but she romanced Alucard. At the end of the game, we see Sonia Belmont give birth to the next generation of Belmont, with the game making it clear that the child's father was Alucard. This would of course mean that if this game had continued to exist in the main timeline and serve as a prequel to the other games, that every Belmont sent had a little bit of vampire in them. You know, the next one down would be like a quarter vampire, 3/4 human, because Alucard was half vampire, half human. And you would have like an 8th, the 16th, the 32nd, so on, so on, so on. It's all very mathematical. Now, on the surface, it seems like a really odd idea, but it kind of works because, especially as the Castlevania games kept going on, you would see the Belmonts doing more and more acts of borderline superhuman strength and stamina. You know, you can't all blame it on getting hit with the whip. The fact is, you know, it's like, dude, how hard do you have to even, like, swing a whip or throw a dagger to kill something undead? Like, there's you guys can't just be well trained. There's got to be a little something more in there. So you could say that teeny little bit of vampire DNA helped enhance the later Belmonts. Most fans assume that due to Sipho's highly magical nature and her marriage to Trevor, and the fact that Trevor is a relatively early member of the Belmont family tree, that it was her magical energy that helped encourage later generations to be powerful enough to fight off the undead. Specifically, people like Simon Belmont from the first 2 Castlevania games, who is the most iconic of the Castlevania characters, since he does appear in multiple games, which is a very rare thing in the Castlevania games, since they tend to jump generations and centuries by and large. So, as I said, Sonia, she gets a lot of credit because even though Castlevania Legends is no longer part of the main timeline, they took one step farther from Sipho and said, okay, we're going to have a female as the primary protagonist. Next up, we would have Castlevania. Officially, that's all the game's called. It is actually a later Castlevania game as opposed to the first iconic one for the NES. This game was released on the N64, thus it is often called by fans Castlevania 64, as well as its director's cut version, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. Now, in both versions of this game, we have the character of Cary Fernandez, and she is one of multiple chosen primary protagonists. Basically, it's one of those games where you only control one player, but you have your choice of different ones, and depending on who you choose, there are slight changes to the game's plot, and of course, playing style. Cary, like Sipho before her, and in fact, in her little alternate timeline that Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. We're going to go with that because that's the expanded director's cut, and it's kind of the better game by and large. And it keeps me from saying 64 over and over again, since that is technically a fan term. You know. But within that timeline, Cary Fernandez is actually alleged to be loosely related to Sipho Belmontes after, a few generations, a little branching path in the family, thus explaining her magical abilities. Now, this game, as well as Cary, are not highly regarded by the Castlevania fan base because being the first 3D Castlevania game attempted, it plays kind of really awkwardly. There's a lot more puzzle element to it than most Castlevania games. And there's kind of a little bit of awkwardness in that Cary is both underage and dresses in a traditional, to the point of stereotype, Japanese schoolgirl outfit, even though she's supposed to be European from centuries in the past. It was just a really awkward character design choice. We do give Cary credit in the Castlevania lore, and in the sense of this video, that she was a playable character in her own right. She was not a sidekick, much like Sonia. She was her own hero in her own right. But it's just really weird because, even Sonia was portrayed as a, full adult who had been trained from a young age to fight, whereas Cary is a young age and is running around in essentially as an anachronism. It's her outfit should not exist in this part of the world in the century it allegedly takes place in. I mean, let's just lay it out. You know, the game does not take place in the 1990s. It does not take place in Japan. There's no reason for her to look the way she does. She doesn't fit. She feels like a character transplanted from another game. But she is there. She is... Oop, a little bit of primping here, folks, as we get into the final haul here. But yes, Cary Fernandez exists. Again, if you're a hardcore Castlevania fan, I would recommend you trying the Legacy of Darkness cartridge as opposed to the original Castlevania 64 release. You get a few more playable characters and selectable paths. As I said, it's basically the enhanced director's cut version of Castlevania 64. You can check out Cary for herself, see how you feel, if she fits tonally and thematically with both the individual game and Castlevania as a whole. But to me, it's like, you know, I'm kind of glad there wasn't a lot of follow-up to this game, because you don't know what to do with the character. I mean, I'm sorry, Cary, you're just awkward. Maybe eventually somebody will make like a, you know, big All-Stars Castlevania game. They've apparently pitched it a few times and it never got fully created and released, except for that Castlevania Judgment Fighting game. But again, that's they basically created total alternate versions of the characters, so we're not going to get into those for these videos. We're trying to stick to the main core versions of the characters. She could have appeared in that and maybe had a little bit of a saving grace, but you know, unless somebody just really feels like we're trying to redeem her character, I have a feeling she's never going to show up again. So, moving on to something a little happier. We are going to discuss another character who shows up initially as a supporting character, actually appeared in multiple games, and more importantly, has been playable depending on the game and which port of it is. This is the female that most fans most associate with Castlevania when you say, hey, what are some good female Castlevania protagonists? Because, as I said, she's actually appeared in multiple games. You see an ongoing story with her, and the fact that those games are generally considered hallmark games in the franchise. We are speaking, for you existing fans, yes, you're going to get an of course here, of course, of Maria Renard. Now, when Maria first appears in Castlevania Rondo of Blood, or the Dracula X Chronicles, depending on the port you're playing, she does in fact show up as a young girl. However, she is already trained as a vampire huntress by her family. Let's see, she's apparently 12 years old originally. Like many Castlevania females, she has magical powers to offset the lack of huge physical strength that your classic Belmont males show. Specifically, she tends to summon animal spirits. In Rondo of Blood, despite all those skills, she is still caught by Dracula and his top minions, and is one of several females imprisoned in Dracula's castle. Thus, you have the option, because, like earlier Castlevania games, Rondo has a bit of a branching path nature to it, of rescuing Maria. Now, if you do rescue her, she will help you out later in the game and factor into the plot elements going through that branching path. However, her real fun and games as a character, and where she was fully embraced, was in the previously mentioned iconic Symphony of the Night. The game takes place 5 years later after Rondo of Blood. She is now 17 years old. Thus has continued training in the nature of vampire hunting and developing her magical powers. And while once again she is seen basically as a sidekick to Richter Belmont, she does show up in the game and has a little bit more of a, what's a good term to use here, impact on the plot. Now, in the game, you do not play as Richter by and large, you play as Alucard. This would be his big return for the first time since Castlevania 3, well, Castlevania Legends, if we're bouncing back into Sonia, but as far as the main timeline, Castlevania 3. So, Alucard sets out to the castle when he hears about Dracula's revival since their battle in the events of Castlevania 3 from 300 years previously. Alucard had basically been in vampiric stasis slumber since then, having no use for humanity and feeling guilty about killing his father, which, shows Alucard's a good guy. This is one of the other things that makes Symphony of the Night an interesting game, is that you are playing both as not as a Belmont and as a vampire. Well, half vampire, but yeah, they took a lot of interesting tweaks with Symphony of the Night. But, as I said, Maria does factor in the plot a little more heavily in Symphony of the Night. And when it's all said and done, she would help Alucard free Richter, and she would go off to help Alucard and Richter, specifically helping the wounded Richter escape the castle as Alucard went to fight his father once again. But for the sake of plot significance, she helped further bring Alucard towards embracing his human side and appreciation for humanity, because when the battle's finished, Alucard's first thought is, hey, once again, I've killed my father. That's really not cool, even though, yes, he is a horrible, non-human, demonic thing at this point. I can't deal. I would rather just, be in my slumber stasis than have to live with this guilt every day. Maria, however, found Alucard to be quite an interesting and handsome man, and convinced him to attempt to wander the world, see how humanity had grown and evolved over the 300 years since he had started his slumber that he had freshly awoken from, and promised to hang with him to help him attempt to readjust. Thus, she would become the second character to form a close emotional bond with Alucard after the previously mentioned Sonia. Maria would show up once again in Castlevania Nocturne of Recollection. Also known as Nocturne of Reminiscence. This is not actually a game. It is a internet radio drama done in Japan that takes place shortly after the events of Symphony of the Night. But it is still important to the plot significance because it does get further into the journeys that Maria and Alucard would take together. This would be the last time she would show up as a major character driving the plot forward. However, she does appear as a hidden character in Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, which featured a few references to previous Castlevania games. Maria, or rather an alternate version of her, would also show up in a couple other non-main timeline Castlevania games. Previously mentioned Castlevania Judgment fighting game, as well as, was it Harmony of Despair, I believe, yeah. Let me double check my notes here. Yes, Harmony of Despair, which was a multiplayer game released on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, specifically the PlayStation 3 version of the PlayStation Network. This was kind of like another one of these all-star type games in that you had different characters from different previously released games mixing together. But it is very non-canon, kind of like Castlevania Judgment. It is its own thing, existing in its own bubble. But that's the whole point. Maria is a fan favorite character. We get to see her in a couple different stages of her life. And when it's all said and done, she is a character who should get a lot of respect because she manages to be one of the major reasons why Richter Belmont had the success he did have in Rondo of Blood, as well as she is the major reason that Alucard knew of Richter's disappearance in Symphony of the Night, as well as the return of Dracula, as well as making sure that Richter was rescued and survived and returned to good health so he could live his own life and continue to create more Belmonts for later generations, so the Belmont-Dracula rivalry could continue for a few more centuries. Good job, Maria. We appreciate you. So, we did mention a little game called Portrait of Ruin. Now, Portrait of Ruin also has a female character who is highly plot significant. This would be our friend Charlotte Allin. She is a lifelong friend of main playable protagonist Jonathan Morris. And unlike previously seen female spellcasters, Charlotte hits up more the classic magic caster ideals in that she's shown carrying around a personal spell book that she uses to cast her magic, and tends to be a little arrogant about her magical abilities and how many great things she can do with it. Which, for a supporting character, is fine. I can see why they had Jonathan Morrison in there, because if all you had to work with was arrogant Charlotte, that would not have made nearly as fun a game to play. Because you generally don't want your main protagonists to be arrogant. You want them to be humble and relatable. Now, Charlotte's a lot of good fun because as somebody who is affiliated with the church, she has gotten intense magical training and has a lot of untapped magical potential. While she's in the process of tapping into that magical potential, I should say, she thinks she has a lot more magic than she does. However, many people, including the church, do believe she has enough magical power to potentially kill Dracula once and for all. Now, Charlotte's kind of she's kind of a halfway point between Maria and the previously mentioned Cary, in that Charlotte, she still does kind of have that school academic aesthetic. She is a little older. And it is more of a European-inspired school outfit instead of the Japanese sailor scout thing that Cary was wearing. So she doesn't feel as misplaced in the series. Of course, it also helps that by this point, she was operating in the 1940s, the mid-1940s. So, yeah, the idea of school uniforms existed back then. Excuse me, I'm going to have to take a little bit of a drink here and cover my can logo. So there is no implication of endorsement of any particular drink. But yeah, as a supporting character, Charlotte works. Even though you still have that spellcasting schoolgirl thing going, it's having her be like 16 instead of like 12, and it being a more timeline and region of the world appropriate school uniform inspiration. She does feel less out of place. She doesn't have quite as much, fun to her character as Maria. She doesn't get as much character development because she only appears in the one primary game. She also appears in that Harmony of Despair. But as I said, that game was kind of like a catch-all thing. So, But her primary game is Portrait of Ruin. So, it's a fun game. Her relationship with Jonathan provides some good, lighthearted moments that help Jonathan's character feel more fleshed out than it would have if he was just running around by himself. So she is definitely key to Portrait of Ruin and the things that make Portrait of Ruin good from a storytelling perspective. So we're going to go ahead and end it with what I consider the potentially most interesting female, in that, like Sonia, she is the primary playable protagonist of her game. Without any of this, pick one of 2 or 3 or 4 character, branching path things. It is her game. And that is Shinoa from Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. Now, one of the other things that makes her interesting is Order of Ecclesia, they took a lot of liberties with the Castlevania formula in the game. Kind of like the previous Symphony of the Night. Because this is a character that has no direct link to the Belmont clan. There are no Belmonts at this point in the timeline. They had basically disappeared into the shadows, been driven underground. So they did not arise to oppose Dracula. But more importantly, other organizations felt that they should not be beholden to the Belmont clan always being there. So they had begun coming up with alternate methods and other people who had the raw potential, kind of like the previous mentioned Charlotte and Jonathan. One of the other things that makes the game interesting is Shinoa doesn't, primarily use, even as a Belmont stand-in replacement, she doesn't primarily use the whips. Yes, she has some swords, but even those are keyed into her magic. She does fit that classic Castlevania trope of females being powerful magic users, Specifically in her case, though, they did once again tweak the idea, because that's one of the things that Order of Ecclesia is all about, is seeing how far from the trope-tastic formula that Castlevania games had both created and embraced they could get, while still being a fun game that respected the Castlevania mythos. See, she is empowered to have various glyphs bonded to her body. A glyph being, for those who don't know the term, basically a magic symbol. Kind of similar to a rune, just from a different cultural aesthetic and perspective. So even when she does use classic weapons like swords, they are magically summoned swords. You know, the idea is you would equip a sword glyph to the arm, push the button, that she would summon that sword glyph, use it for a moment, and then it would evaporate back into the glyph until she summons it again. Now, over the course of Order of Ecclesia, you can find many glyphs, thus you can really change up her playstyle over the course of the game, and it adds a lot of replayability. It's like, oh, well, I'm just going to do this, dual-wielding swords, or I'm going to try it, with these weapons instead. So, that's the kind of thing with Shinoa. She plays differently than a lot of characters. She uses a different form of magic than we've seen in any previous Castlevania games. Her story has nothing to do with the Belmont-Dracula rivalry. She is from a completely different group that is actually trying to replace the Belmonts as the primary opponents and destroyers of Dracula. But even then, most of her story isn't directly about hunting down Dracula, but preparing herself for the fight against Dracula, and specifically dealing with some internal strife and drama within the Order of Ecclesia. Again, a lot of tweaks to what you expect from a Castlevania game, but it's a classic 2D platformer. You've got the supernatural critters. You've got Dracula in the shadows as a threat. It controls and feels like a Castlevania character, so it works. In a lot of ways, it might actually be a good game for people who are not already hardcore invested in Castlevania, because if you're not 100% sold on the idea of Belmont swinging whips around, you like that RPG element to it, with equipping different stuff and leveling up and kind of managing stat growth, this would be a good game for you. It's that RPG platform mix to it. You can play this game and then kind of ease your way into other games that pull you a little closer into that classic Castlevania experience. Find your comfort zone. Now, Shinoa would have a couple alternate versions of her show up in Judgment and Harmony of Despair. However, there is yet to be a direct sequel to Order of Ecclesia. At least as of right now. Personally, I would not mind seeing her show up again in another main timeline game. Even if as a supporting character, passing the torch on. Because that's the thing with the Castlevania games. They cover so many centuries that there's plenty of holes. Little hole in the timeline where you could plug in a different adventure dealing with various people, if not fighting Dracula directly, fighting the fallout from Dracula, temporarily dying again and not being in control of the various supernatural critters. There's a lot of storyline potential. And having characters like Shinoa and Maria and Sonia and Sipho. They're all there to channel from and utilize and inspire even more characters. Because that's the thing. It's 2020. We have got piles of games showing female protagonists can be embraced by everybody. There's no reason to sit there and say you gotta stick to the big bicep male Belmonts. Cracking the whips. We have those Castlevania games already. So game developers, go out there. Be inspired by Castlevania. Be inspired by some of the specific characters we've saluted today. And remember, you can continue the theme of a game. You can sequelize games that can feel like a respectful sequel, but you can still make your own tweaks. You can still make your own footprint in them. Castlevania 2 did a lot of things Castlevania 1 didn't. Castlevania 3 was closer to Castlevania 1, but still tried its own experiments. Symphony of the Night completely changed up the formula. Order of Ecclesia really tweaked with the nature of what a Castlevania protagonist could be. And then you got games, as I said, like Judgment, which completely changed the genre into a fighting game. Harmony of Despair, which just plain had fun with the whole concept of what Castlevania, could be. But no matter what you do with it, join us next week in 7. Because we are full of positivity. We are full of constructive criticism. We are not here to tear anything down. We are here to build up. So if you're going to stay home, stay with us. Remember to check out all the other fabulous Friday Rambling videos we have here on the archive. Check out the Tuesday Bardic Plays game streams. Join us live for those Tuesday streams or watch the archives. And check out the other videos produced by my partner in crime, Jaime, a.k.a. Rich, a.k.a. he who has a lot more life than me, so can't live on YouTube as often as I do. And ultimately, hey, if you have problems being productive, make like a Belmont and crack that whip. See you in 7.